What's up, Buttercups? Welcome to a Mean Age Daydream, where I am very excited to have some company today. I know you're shocked to see me with another guest on the show, but I'm excited to say it is the one and the only Phillip W. Magness, I should say. Phillip is a senior fellow and oops, sorry, I'm getting a little echo back there, Phil. I should quiet down my voice. He is a senior fellow and the David J. Theroux Chair in Political Economy at the Independent Institute. And you do a ton of work in the economics of slavery, Caribbean world, as well as other aspects of economic history. Phil, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great. Well, as I mentioned in the lead-in, we were just kind of doing a quick chat. You are well known among my colleagues and very obviously well respected. You've been on with John Odermatt, Lou Perez. Thanks very highly of you. You just spoke to him as well fairly recently. But today we are here to talk about your new book, which is, and I'll hold it up if you want to see, The 1619 Project Myth. And this is published by the Independent Institute. And this is your, I think, third book. Is that correct?
Third of a full books, and then I've edited a few volumes as well on top of that. So
yes, fantastic. Well, yeah, you definitely do keep busy. I'll give you that. Amongst, starting fights with various historians and people for economic matters. Well, I think first things first, I'd love to hear, where was the genesis of this? And I will preface it by saying, obviously we saw this come out, and I think it was, right before COVID. But I think it comes out at the release of this book at a very pertinent time in, I guess, what we see going on throughout the world, right? An attempt by parties to erase cultures, to erase histories, to influence the understandings of capitalism, of socialism. So I think this book comes at a perfect time to debunk at least one of these myths. So tell me a little bit more about how you got into it, where you started, and the genesis of wanting to create this.
Yeah, so the real origin of it was the morning in August 2019 when I was sitting there eating my breakfast, and I usually browse through all the morning newspapers to see what was going on. And I saw the New York Times had this brand new series on looking at the history of slavery. And my first reaction to that was kind of excitement because I'm a historian that studies slavery. And when a national newspaper starts looking at your area of expertise, you think, oh, finally someone's paying attention to what I work on. And a little bit of background on that. This wasn't the first time the New York Times had done a historical series. A few years before that was the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. And they did this great series called Disunion, where they asked hundreds of historians to do almost like a day-by-day retrospective on the different issues of the Civil War as it played out over that roughly 4-year period from 2011 to 2015. And I actually wrote a couple pieces for that. So I saw the 1619 Project, like, well, okay, they're going back into the slavery business. This is good for me in terms of research. And then I started reading it. And found it was a very, very different product than what the New York Times had done in the past, where they brought in experts that actually knew what they were talking about. And to be honest, the first essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones, it's the one that sets the stage for the entire 1619 Project, but she also lays out her thesis about the American Revolution. And I'm reading through it, and I start noticing there's some problems with this, but let's give it a chance. Let's see where it goes. And there are about a dozen essays in the whole series. It's really when I got to the second essay, which was Matthew Desmond's piece on the relation between slavery and capitalism, which is like directly in an area I work on. It's directly something I've written about. And I'm reading through this piece and I see like an error every paragraph. I want to slam the laptop closed because it was such atrocious representation of the scholarship. And, I immediately noticed the errors, things that I had covered in my own work. And within a day or two of that, other publications had seen the 1619 Project coming out. And they were like, okay, well, who can we get that's a historian of slavery to talk about this economic issue that's being raised here? So I get an invitation from a couple other publications. They're like, please help us walk through the 1619 Project. And we really like you to take a look at this Matthew Desmond essay. Because by then, some of the firestorm had started around Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I had my criticisms there as well. but I was really the first person out the gate to critique the Matthew Desmond essay. And what I thought was going to be like a one or two short commentaries ended up turning into basically a book-length publication that played out instead of just a few days after the 1619 project, really played out over the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I'd seen in reading some of the essays, essays that you had published, counter essays to some of the claims made in the 1619 project. And as you mentioned, that was interesting. And, I'm trying to think where to start and how to go about our breaking this down. So I definitely want to get into Matthew Desmond, because that's,
Absolutely.
Very clearly, this sociologist masquerading as an economist and a historian has a lot of issues. But, to the point about engaging here, you get invited onto these shows and you try to make the most and say, okay, look, let me put out some inaccuracies here, but that creates its own firestorm, because then, of course, the people like Nikole Hannah-Jones, Matthew Desmond, and others seek to defend their work and seemingly will not take any sort of criticism, no matter what the sources. Is that pretty much what you experienced?
That is entirely it. And in fact, I wrote an early criticism, but it was a very measured one, focused on this claim that slavery and capitalism are intertwined, and looked at some of the evidence that they had cited in favor of that. I found, there are basic historical errors here. There are math errors. There are misrepresentations of sources. And yes, I'm going to walk them through that. But the other thing that I did very early on in the project is I actually wrote the New York Times and asked them to consider a correction of some actually false claims. The first one, so Desmond had this line at the opening of his essay where he says, and he credits it to some other historians, he says that Microsoft Excel spreadsheets in the modern day are derivative of accounting books from the slave plantations. And it's like this whole thing is like American capitalism, including Microsoft Excel, if you're using that on your computer, is embedded into the slave system and derivative of its legacy, and all these horrible things follow. And I'm reading through this, and I knew the book he was attributing this to, and it was sitting on my bookshelf. So I pulled it out, and I flipped open the book, and find that exact passage. And the author of the book, she states, "I am not claiming that Microsoft Excel derived from the plantation books here. I'm just investigating the history of plantation accounting." It's a very straightforward scholarly claim. And I'm like, okay, this guy misread the book and misquoted it or paraphrased it. This is a very clear, obvious answer. I should write the New York Times and say, you're the paper of record. You have a history of making corrections. This one needs to be corrected. And that they kind of blew me off as a response to the answer. I finally got one of the editors to reply, and he says, "Well, we looked at the passage, and that's just a difference of interpretation." I'm like, "No, I can show you side by side. This is an error." And it went downhill from there. So that was my good faith effort to get the paper on a constructive path of scholarship just hit a brick wall of resistance. And then I started engaging with Nikole Hannah-Jones directly. And her standard response to any and every criticism is to attack the critic, just ad hominem name calling. I wasn't the only critic. There were several prominent historians that questioned her work on what she was saying about the American Revolution being like this defense of slavery. And she starts tweeting out that they're old white guys, and therefore we shouldn't pay attention to them. And one of the other more ironic things,
which I love, by the way, is also, sorry to interrupt you, but just I love it. They're old white guys, and we shouldn't pay attention to what they have to say or what they have to think. So not only is it, taking it, never mind the measure of a man being by his skin color, but also ignore his character. Yeah, none of it matters to Nikole Hannah-Jones.
It was utterly bizarre. I'm sitting here watching. This is a reporter at a national newspaper, and she's acting like a child on TV and on social media, and just engaging in a name calling fest every time someone tries to point out and correct her. And you find out, come to learn a little bit later on, the New York Times had actually hired a fact checker to read this essay about the American Revolution. Very well-known, distinguished historian of the American Revolution, Leslie Harris, and she reveals in print to Politico a couple months later that she warned Nikole Hannah-Jones not to make this claim. So this is not something you can sustain in the evidence, and they ignored her.
And in particular, just to make it clear what you're talking about here, Phil. So you're specifically referencing the 1619 concept. right? That the founding of the country should have begun in 1619, right? With the delivery of this 20-man slave ship, and that was the official founding, right?
Yeah, that's the official founding, and that taints everything that follows from it up to the American Revolution. Because her whole narrative is we want to displace 1776 as the founding of America, and her way of going about doing that is asserting that 1776 was really like this defensive revolution on behalf of slavery. Which is a very backward, simplistic, and confused way of looking at the American Revolution. It turns out there are slaveholders on both sides of the Revolution. There are slaveholding colonists that revolt. There are slaveholding loyalists. There are slaveholding colonial officials that want to set up shop under British rule in North America. There are abolitionists on the American side. There are abolitionists on the British side. There are abolitionists in the British Parliament who support the Americans. It's a very complex issue. And Nicole Hannah-Jones had this ridiculous, simplistic narrative that she was trying to shoehorn into her political story about 1619 being the true founding.
Yeah. Well, I thought you had some really interesting points. We talked about the differences of opinion on, and to your point, the New York Times did correct, I think, one of the lines in it to say that some, like it stated before that it was a primary driver, right? That slavery was a primary driver of the revolution. They had to correct that.
Some.
Some, just some of the colonists.
And that was really the only overt correction and concession that they ever made to the thing.
Yeah. Well, and I want to come around to talk about the genesis of the 1619 project too, and where you think it drove from, because again, it's a little hard staying on a track here. There's a lot of interconnected wires and lines here with the anti-capitalism, or I'm sorry, the new history of capitalism. Right, seems to be a primary driver. So I want to circle back to that.
Yeah.
After I talk about one item is that, we talk about these different people on different sides, and you make the point in the book that there are so many arguments that, no, emancipation wasn't driven by, the revolution wasn't driving because people wanted to keep the slaves. And in fact, keeping, in the revolution in many other places, like those, I think it was like the West Indies and Jamaica, after, they receded, they actually thought that they thought they were safer under the crown, even though the British had in fact gotten rid of slavery. Well, they were taken care of. They were just fine. And there was no reason for the United States to operate under that conception that somehow slavery would be overturned if the Revolutionary War hadn't occurred.
Right. So it's just a complete falsification of history. To get back to the motives, so Nicole Hannah-Jones tackled this project as it's ostensibly a history project intermixed with journalism. But what I argue in the book, and this becomes more and more apparent as the 1619 debate plays out over the next 5 years, it was really a political project for the present day, just using and weaponizing and drawing upon the past as a tool to make arguments for what are essentially very left-wing, progressive, anti-capitalist political objectives in 2020. It's something that was written for elections today to advance the cause of wealth redistribution and slavery reparations and maybe like nationalized health care and the Green New Deal more than actually reckoning with the past of slavery. Although they use slavery as the original sin, the original injustice that supposedly taints American capitalism and therefore makes these policies, these redistributive policies that Nicole Hannah-Jones wanted, okay and permissible and just and the right thing to do. So it's taking this present day political objective and rewriting the past as if it's like a court brief in argument for reparations today. And it really does a travesty to the historical record. So if you're a scholar that's interested in actually deciphering and disentangling the complexities of slavery in the past, this is no better than the most politicized version of patriotic rah-rah, yay, America history that comes out of the Trump world. It's just coming from the left wing.
Yeah. I mean, you make an interesting point there. Just like you, when the 1619 project came out, I was like, okay, I'm open to seeing what these people have to say. And knowing that you say the rah-rah historian, and Trump obviously wants to make American history, rewrite in his own image. I have problems with that. But the fact that we do know that history is written by the victors, and of course you're going to have some revisionism and you're going to have some things be painted in a more popular way. We all acknowledge that. So the 1619 project, okay, maybe this should have some sort of impact. But as you have pointed out, because of the basis on so much of the new history of capitalist, quote unquote, scholarship that they use in this, including, and now we'll turn to Matthew Desmond.
Exactly.
You cite so many of the inaccuracies and fundamental inaccuracies that seem to be blatantly obvious to anybody that bake the foundations for some of the major essays in this. The Desmond essay, if you don't mind going into that a little bit, and his statement that these slaves were essentially responsible for half of the GDP of the United States. I'm reading through this, just shaking my head because it's making me so frustrated.
Well, and that's the thing. So the new history of capitalism, it's an interesting movement in itself because it's essentially the same type of politicized present day history projected onto the past, and it predates the 1619 Project about a decade. This is a group of mostly elite Ivy League professors. They're all very, very heavily situated on the far left in their personal politics. It's Ed Baptist at Cornell, Sven Beckert at Harvard. There are a few others that, and they turn out they're all the people that either Desmond relies upon or the 1619 Project consults with. And what they essentially did is, after the financial crisis in 2008, they decided that they, as historians, needed to investigate the history of capitalism as if no one had ever done this before. So hence the new. They're obsessed with their own novelty. And of course, their investigation of the history of capitalism immediately turns to the economics of slavery. Now, I'm an economic historian by background. Slavery is probably the most heavily researched topic in all of American economic history. It was the genesis of empirical analysis, the Cleometric Revolution in economic history back in the late 1950s. They started applying statistical models to study the past. Well, what did they do? They looked at records from slave plantations. This is something that's won Pulitzer Prizes, the Bancroft Prize. It's something that has dominated the economic history profession and large parts of the history profession for decades. Most of the second half of the 20th and early 21st century, this was the major scholarly theme. And here you have these guys coming along in 2008, 2009, and they're declaring, we're the new historians of capitalism. We're the first to ever investigate this. That tells me these people have not done their homework. And you see this in Ed Baptist's book, which is really the core basis of the Matthew Desmond essay. His essay is essentially like a summary, a book report on it, thrown in with some politics. But a really bad one because he keeps mistaking and messing up even some of the errors that the Baptist made. But Baptist wrote this book called The Half Has Never Been Told. Again, obsessed with their own novelty. And the thesis of Baptist's book is that American capitalism was originally this entrepreneurial enterprise on the plantations that figured out ways how to more efficiently and coercively extract labor out of slaves. And he bases this, he actually goes back to some of the statistics. So there are studies of the growth of the cotton industry in the American South before the Civil War. And it has a roughly 400% growth trajectory from 1800 to 1860. This is a well-known fact. The big question is why, and most economists that have studied this issue have come up with some very plausible explanations. The main reason is technology. Farming technology improved. They started blending seeds of cotton seeds together, and they got more disease-resistant strains, and you get better yield out of that. So it's a very clear, uncontroversial part of agricultural history. Baptist looks at this and says, no, I'm going to take their statistic, but I'm going to discard their evidence of why this statistic happened and supplant it with my own thesis. And his thesis is, he refers to it as the whipping machine, that we started beating slaves more efficiently. I don't want to minimize slavery as a horrible institution. There are records of this, but he plays fast and loose with the evidence. There's no proof that like slave owners in 1850 are more efficient at beating their slaves than slave owners in 1830. No, it's a horrific institution throughout. And he actually misrepresents some of his textual evidence to get to this thesis, but just inserts it in there as fact. And then he overlays this with a radical exaggeration of the role of slavery in the U.S. economy. Desmond kind of picks up on this. So he says, well, cotton's a big industry, which it was, but there are lots of big industries in that era. There are railroads. There are iron and steel is coming into its own. textiles are coming to its own, but he says cotton. It's a raw material that has a lot of different applications. It's a raw material into some of the textile mills in New England. It's traded abroad. And then he starts doing all these other calculations. He goes, oh, wait a minute. Plantations were insured. So the insurance industry is wrapped up in plantation slavery. The shipping industry that moves the cotton from south across the sea, that's wrapped up into slavery. So he starts doing all these back of the envelope calculations and adds up anything and everything that's even tangentially connected to cotton plantations, and comes up to this ridiculous figure to essentially, he says in his numerator, that cotton produced by slaves on plantations account for 50% of the GDP of the United States before the Civil War.
No.
And the error here is so he's doing all these calculations of intermediary goods in the numerator. He doesn't adjust the denominator, because if you want to do that actual calculation, you'd also have to figure out, well, what about transport for iron? What about transport in the railroad industry, steamships, things that are completely unconnected for slavery? So he doesn't make that other adjustment. And really, it turns out if you do the math right, cotton production is about 5 or 6% of GDP, not 50% of GDP. So it's a major error that this entire book is based around. Misinterpretation of evidence this book is based around. And here Matthew Desmond comes along, a sociologist that had never worked in this field, picks up Baptist and a couple of these other new history of capitalism authors and just regurgitates them as if they're unchallenged gospel and builds an entire narrative out of it.
Well, I mean, that reminds me of just even the premise of, the 1619 Project and the 1619, quote, founding, and
Yes.
even what Hannah Nicole Jones had done, I mean, using these arguments that are, some could say, more applicable to others, but there were only two of them. And there were so many other sources to either refute it, question it, or just ignores the overall context of what the Revolutionary War was stated to be fought under and the conditions it was fought under. And I mean, it just seems like, when you get to this type of scholarship, and if you don't mind, just kind of citing the Hannah Nicole Jones items that she went off of as the founding of this concept, but so often you see this with activists, I should say, history activists, whatever you want to call it. The papers they position are always based in very thin evidence that's extrapolated, and as you mentioned before, tied in with so much political jargon and so much weight under the threat of social cancellation or intimidation. Absolutely. That they're just accepted.
Absolutely. And we see that in the 1619 Project. No, I characterize it as assembling your footnotes by cherry picking and backfilling. So she already had her narrative that she wanted to tell. Now, the original version, it's journalism. It doesn't have footnotes in it. And I think she actually went through an uh-oh moment after she published this narrative and realized that she hadn't done her homework or read the scholarship, just like Matthew Desmond had not read any of the economic history of slavery prior to these new historians of capitalism. And therefore, he misstates the basic evidence on multiple levels. So she does the same thing in her lead essay. And then as well-known mainstream historians start calling her out, rather than adjusting the essay, meeting them in discussion, figuring out where the truth lies, going back and looking at the sources, she instead starts scouring the internet to cherry pick the few fringe peripheral historians that have made similar arguments there. And you go through her footnotes, she actually misrepresents or exaggerates how much that they are on her side. So it's a really tendentious way of going about constructing history. And it gets even worse than that on some of the other elements of her essay. So, I'm a historian of the Civil War era. I work on slavery. One area that I work on directly was the colonization movement during the American Civil War. This is the shipping of freed slaves back to Liberia, or also Central America. They looked at several places on that. And one thing I credited Nicole Hannah Jones for early on in her essay, she says, this is a complexity of the Civil War era that has not gotten enough attention. Obviously, I agree with that. There's often the simplistic, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the 13th Amendment passes, and slavery is done. No, there are actually all these other plans that are considered in the midst of those debates about what does a post-slavery society look like, and the colonizationists wanted to actually separate. They wanted to ship freed slaves elsewhere abroad, incentivize them, and Abraham Lincoln dabbled in this more extensively than many historians had acknowledged. So I wrote an entire book and several articles on this. Myself and Seb Page, "Colonization After Emancipation" is a book length treatment of colonization in the Civil War era. And that came out in 2011. So when Nicole Hannah Jones starts getting criticized over this because they package it in, oh, she's revising the Civil War history as well, I actually came to her defense and said, no, this is one area where she's got it right. And she's on Twitter one day and she's defending herself and she tweets out a link to my book. And she tweets out a link to the article I had written to the Disunion series in the New York Times 7 or 8 years earlier on this exact subject, the colonization movement and the Civil War. Say, look, historians agree with me here. And then someone points out and goes, you realize that's Phil Magness. That's the guy that you're battling with over the new history of capitalism. And all of a sudden, all the tweets get deleted. And he starts attacking me personally, says, I'm not qualified to critique her. And this is one of the things that's really galling about it. So she had her original essay. She revised that essay for the book length form of the 1619 Project a couple of years later. The only passage she changes in any substantive way is her discussion of the colonization movement around Lincoln. She deletes any mention of claims that were based on my scholarship and replaces them with Ibram X. Kendi as her new source. So it's like, I'm going to reward or penalize people that I cite based on whether they support my politics. It's just an absurd way of doing scholarship. And I think, frankly, it's dishonest.
Well, absolutely. I mean, well, I would argue that the people leaving the movement against capitalism as a whole are patently dishonest, and
Yes.
I say that because so much of and you document it well in the book. So much of what the driving motivation here does seem to be to just simply undermine capitalism. If you say that slavery created the United States, and you can then debunk, quote unquote, debunk capitalism, and even though there is a great excerpt here where you have a nice chapter or an essay that you have created citing some arguments that were, I think it was by Theroux, specifically arguing for slavery and how slavery was anti-capitalism. And I highlighted it. I'm not going to waste time by pulling up the exact highlight, but I'll just kind of vaguely quote. Oh, wait, here we go. I do have it right here. Let me just read this real quick because I got a kick out of it. I was laughing in that Theroux is basically arguing that because as an ethical and social guide, the philosophy teaches that social, individual, and national competition is a moral duty, and we have attempted to prove all competition is but the effort to enslave others without being encumbered with their support. So his argument is that, well, capitalism is slavery. Everybody's enslaved in some way, so it's better if they're actually slaves because they're getting more of their labor because you have to feed them and house them.
He calls the plantation the most perfect form of socialism that the world has invented to date. It's so, and this is a point that I make about the new historians of capitalism are generally atrocious on this point because, again, they're political activists. They want to tear down capitalism, and what they really mean is free market capitalism. So they do this pivot game. They'll say capitalism and anything and everything economic that they dislike is capitalism. But then their prescriptive game is that the market is unregulated and we need to come in and redistribute wealth. So they're attacking free market capitalism, but they don't know anything about the intellectual history of this entire concept of what they're attacking, of free markets, of capitalism. So one of the points I draw out in the book is if you look at the founding theorists of figures of capitalism, it's Adam Smith. It's The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And there's a whole succession of economists that write in that tradition throughout the 18th and 19th century. Well, it turns out Adam Smith's an abolitionist. He disapproves of slavery. He wants to see it abolished. He writes lengthy treatises about the immorality of it and the economic backwardness of it. And this is what Theroux takes his ire about. Theroux's writing on the eve of the Civil War in the 1850s. And he says that Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say and all these free market economic thinkers are the enemies of slavery and need to be cast into the fire. And he opens his book by saying that essentially free market capitalism, the laws of supply and demand, introduce chaos and disorder to the world. We need planning. We need a proper ordering of society, and only the plantation can give that to you. Theroux's so far out there, he says essentially that under wage labor, under free labor systems, the laborer is destined to be exploited, to be robbed of the surplus value of his production by the owner of the factory, who keeps him in a state of subjugation. And this is why we need slavery to rectify this, because these slave owners, well, they provide food and clothing and housing for all the people under their care. And it's really each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It's essentially a pre-Marxian version of Marxism that he's advocating, but he's wrapping it up in the plantation system. So this intellectual history is completely missing from the new history of capitalism, and they've got it so backward, so inverted from how people in the 19th century understood slavery to operate, that they made this modern 21st century anti-capitalist claim to project onto the past, all for political reason.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about the the context in which these people are presenting history and the absolute abdication of any spine, as evidenced by the American Historical Association.
Yeah.
The episode with that is just despicably embarrassing and makes you question what history can we even trust anymore.
That's exactly it. So this plays out, it's a multi-year debate over the 1619 Project. It gets politicized, although the early critics of it were not Donald Trump or Republicans. I think Newt Gingrich weighed in very early on, but for the most part, they're historians that come from across the spectrum. Everything from center-left mainstream historians to the really far left, the Trotskyites. The World Socialist website came after it. And then you got someone like me who's like a free market, classical liberal, libertarian economic historian, and I'm critiquing it on several of the same lines. So it was really a nonpartisan, just good scholarship movement that originally critiques the 1619 Project. But as it starts playing out and becoming a culture war battle, that becomes taboo for any scholar on the left. Most of the critics on the center left were very distinguished, late career, tenured people that have no career repercussions for going after the 1619 Project. But when the New York Times starts swinging at it, younger historians get scared. They get skittish.
Mm.
And then the New York Times starts flexing. Nicole Hannah-Jones starts, she makes it clear that if anyone criticizes her on matters of substance, she's going to flame them on Twitter with a barrage of insults and obscene gestures and you name it. And try to get them canceled. And this actually happens a couple of years after the 1619 Project comes out. James Sweet, he's the president of the American Historical Association. And this is like an honorary position. They give it to a distinguished historian every year. It's a rotating type of a thing. So it marks a good career. But the president of the American Historical Association also gets to write a column in their newsletter. And he wrote a very measured column calling on historians from across the spectrum to reject political presentism in their work. And it's very balanced. He says Republicans do this in their work. They try to enlist history as a weapon to their political causes in the present day. And he cited Trump and some other examples of that. But he says also Democrats do this in their work. And he cites the 1619 Project and repeats very sound, credible criticisms of it in a neutral, scholarly way. And within minutes of this thing going online, the Twitter mob has descended.
Mm.
The ultra woke wing of the Academy is posting underneath the thread where the AHA had posted this article, the names and personal email addresses and phone numbers of all the board members of the AHA and saying, mob, go harass them. Let's cancel this guy.
Yeah.
I'm watching this play out in real time. And the mob, of course, descends. And Nicole Hannah-Jones kind of pokes it along by retweeting some people on it. And within like 48 hours, the AHA has capitulated and they have forced Sweet to issue a statement apologizing for all the harm that his words had caused. It's like a Maoist struggle session that played out.
No.
And this is telling me in real time that the history profession is much more concerned about, upholding the political values of this editorial project than they are in getting the facts right. And you actually start reading some of the comments and responses, the people that are calling for the cancellation of Sweet, they are announcing, and I'm basically paraphrasing, but this is almost exact words. I quote several examples in the book of historians. They say, even if Sweet is factually right, we can't say this because this is giving evidence to Donald Trump and the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting here watching, you have just completely foregone any claim of credibility as a historian if that's the measure that you're arguing on.
Yeah,
So I'm watching
absolutely.
against this.
Absolutely. And I can't remember if it was the same person or a different person as well, but also historians that will go out and they'll say, well, you can't critique this as history. This is a piece of journalism. Like, well, it's not being presented as a piece of journalism. It's being presented as a piece of historical fact.
Yeah.
So, you pick your side here. It's clearly your side is political and not historical.
Well, that's it. They play what I call Schrodinger's 1619 project. It's history when it needs to be history, journalism when it needs to be journalism, and when it comes under criticism from one side, it suddenly pivots to the other. But when so they do that intentionally because Nicole Anna Jones, she doesn't want to be pinned down in either position. If she's a journalist doing editorial work, she can take liberties with facts and just say this is a difference of interpretation, this is a flourish. If she's a historian, she has to cite sources. She wants the credibility of being a historian, but she wants the liberty of being an editorial journalist. And that plays out with every subsequent iteration, not only the original version, the book version, which takes the 1619 project and actually makes it worse. And then even further beyond that, she does a Hulu docu-series, which is just pure political editorializing. They dropped the Microsoft Excel line about that being derivative of plantations, but then they replace it. The Amazon distribution facility is now the modern day plantation. And they go around like talking to labor union leaders, and it's really kind of a patently offensive approach, saying that they're suffering similar plights to slaves on a plantation in 1850. And yeah, you want to talk about hyperbolic absurdities there, but that was the political message that they were doing. And that editorializing is pervasive throughout the entire 1619 project, what they were going for.
Well, let's wrap up on this. I know we just have a couple minutes left. And then I want you to tell people where they can find you, as well as the 1619 Project Myth, which of course I know is available on Amazon. But one of the biggest concerns I have about this, and I remember raging about this on Twitter X now, when it came out that New York Times was trying to sell this into schools. Donate or sell. I would say sell number one, donate number two, but sell this into schools, into classrooms, and make it part of the educational curriculum, which just drove me insane because not only is it politically charged, not only is it leaning, further into racially charging the educational environment, but also, as we're talking about, it is not history. And yet it's being positioned as this is history. So tell me a little bit about your objections to that. And also, I don't know, how prevalent is it? Do you have any idea?
Yeah. So it's hard to say because there's no official statistic to say how many classrooms have adopted the 1619 project. But what we do know for a fact is the day the 1619 project launched, the New York Times, in combination with the Pulitzer Center, as nonprofit, they rolled out a K-12 curriculum, ready-made lesson plans, set to go. Here's how you can read the 1619 project in your classroom, and here are the discussions for it. And they've only expanded since then. The Hulu series came out. It's now here you can show the Hulu documentary in your classroom, and here's a lesson plan built around it. So there has been quite a bit of money dumped into this by the New York Times and several of its associates into getting it into classroom adoptions. Nicole Hannah Jones also went on a speaking tour to school libraries and community centers, getting paid. She asked honorarium like $40,000 to do a 1 hour lecture. I mean, that's great work.
Nice. Yeah,
but,
nice.
But she was out there very aggressively pushing it into the classroom. And one of the points I make, okay, first off, this isn't up to snuff as quality scholarship. It's not suitable for classroom adoption on that basis. But nonetheless, if you wanted to have it as a debate material, you wanted to bring in, say, let's read the 1619 project essay, and then let's read a couple of the rebuttals to it side by side. That's actually a very instructive classroom exercise because it gets students to critically think and evaluate pros and cons and evidence and see who has the stronger case. I want students to be doing that, but that's not what the 1619 project aims for. They want to be the only game in town telling their narrative. And you can actually see this across the curriculum. And there are very, very few classrooms that have adopted any of the rebuttals, whether it's the 5 historians that write to the New York Times, whether it's mine, whether it's the World Socialist website. I don't care. I just want good historical discussion and scholarship entering into that fray. But no, it's not there. The discussion questions are all about affirming the conclusions politically that the 1619 Project wants you to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you do a great job in the 1619 Project I can't talk. 1619 Project Myth. There we go. Again, guys, this is Phillip Magness. Okay, so Phil, where can they find you if they want to find you in particular? And then, like you said, you can find the book on Amazon, but anywhere else you want to tell people.
Absolutely. So independent.org, that's the Independent Institute's website. And I post most of my writings and commentaries go up there, including we're getting ready to launch a new historical initiative around the American 250th anniversary, which is next year, which will be scholarly in its purpose and actually looking at the past and interpreting questions that have not been sufficiently answered there. So yeah, I'd encourage you to check out independent.org, 1619 Project Myth. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's in some booksellers in physical copy as well. And you can also order it through the Independent Institute website.
All right. Are you on X? Do you want
people to know? Phil W. Magness.
There you go. All right, Phil, this has been fantastic. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your scholarly work and trying to correct the record on this nonsense. These socialists masquerading as historians trying to take down capitalism. Greatly appreciate you. And to all of our watchers and listeners out there, greatly appreciate you guys as well. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to give a comment, share, retweet, etc. All right, from me, from Phil, from the Lions Liberty Network, and from Mean Age Daydream, keep those electric eyes on me, babe, and keep that ray gun to my head. We'll talk to you later.